Well, hey friends, no garage hostage video this week, though I am recording from home. Uh, Today was Linwood's field day, and while I was excited about cooler spring and summer temperatures when we moved up here, um, a day where it is breezy and in the 50s is not a great time to be in a school dunking booth. But that's where I was earlier this morning. I have dried out and warmed up and am now got the kids home from school. So if you hear some background noise, you'll know what it is. And I'm getting a chance to record tonight's lesson. We're continuing on in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26 is a long chapter. Even after this evening, we will not have made it all the way through, even though we started last week. This is kind of getting to the heart of the gospel story. And so Matthew has a lot of points that he's trying to make, and he uses Jesus' life, Jesus' actions, what's going on around, as informative for the early church, and therefore informative for us. We're going to continue the pattern we started a few weeks ago, where I'm going to give you the verses and then tell you to pause the video, and then when you're done reading, unpause so we can continue on. Um, the time that we have together this evening, and I'm going to get to the reading here quickly in a minute, because I'm going to spend some time talking about Judas, who plays a huge role, obviously, in this story, and for any number of reasons, all of them pretty well deserved, has taken his lumps. Peter, too, as a deserter, much like Thomas, ends up wearing it, even though others are doing the same thing he's doing. He may be the face of it, and that's probably the important part for us to know. He's the face of the reaction of all of them. And that's kind of what Matthew wants his audience to see, and we'll get into that here in just a few minutes. So what I want you to do, starting in verse 31, and reading through, where did I mark? What did I decide? 56, 31 through 56. So Matthew chapter 26, 31 through 56, I want you to go ahead and pause the video and then read that stretch of verses, and then unpause the video, and we will come back in and take a look at what these verses have for us. And I think there's a lot here to talk about, especially given Matthew's theological points and arc that he's making beginning to end of his gospel. So hit pause, read the verses, and we'll continue on in just a second. All right, welcome back. So as you read through those verses, what you see is the tension and burden that Jesus is carrying, and the relative obliviousness or downright disengagement, or animosity in the case of Judas, from Jesus' disciples. And I mean, I think that says something about their expectations and their level of understanding for what Jesus is going through. So Jesus makes the statement in verse 31 that all of you are going to desert. And of course, I talked about this. Peter ends up wearing it. He's the one who opens his mouth and says, even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you. And Jesus' reply is about, it says the rooster crows, but the phrase there is cock crow. And that's kind of a specific time, as marked in the ancient world. Some, I believe it's John's gospel uses or is it Luke's, uses the whole rooster crows 3 times thing. Matthew doesn't follow the same trajectory. Instead, it is this particular time, this deadline, essentially, this before, and it's not that far away from this moment. That's what's wild. Like, I think if we timed it out, it's like in the next 6 or 8 hours is essentially what Jesus tells him. It's like, yeah, quarter of a day, you're gonna have plenty of opportunity to own me, and you're going to choose not to in those opportunities. Now, what often gets glossed over is the last verse in that section, verse 35. I told you there'd be some background noise from children. That all the other disciples vowed the same thing. And again, this is one that we've put on Peter, right? But we get that last little throwaway verse, essentially, verse that we fly right over. This is the biblical Midwest flyover country. But all of the other disciples make the exact same claim. No matter what happens, no matter what's going on, we will never bail on you. And I think they meant it. But again, I think their dedication to Jesus was not to Jesus as he was, it was to Jesus as they expected him to be. Why would you abandon somebody who you believe is going to crush the opposition? Like the guy who can stand up to everything. Why would you ever feel need to abandon him? Of course, by this point, Judas has already made an agreement to betray. And knowing that, Jesus walks off, takes these 3 other disciples with him, his inner group. Hold on just a second. Hayes, I told you quietly in your room, bub. Thank you. They're trying to earn extra switch time by being quiet while I do this. And you can see how that's going. Jesus takes the 3 other disciples, this inner circle, those who are kind of closest. And it's in this time where those 3 are gone that Judas must go missing in Matthew's rendition. Other Gospels, Judas gets up and leaves the table. But instead, I think Matthew kind of has this outside looking in feel to it. And so because Judas is on the outside looking in, this is the moment where his opportunity arises. Jesus, on the other hand, takes Peter and James and John with him, and he lets them know how he's feeling. My soul is like crushed to the point of death. And he asks for them to stick with him, especially on the heels of Peter saying, I will never abandon you. I will never, essentially I will never fall short. He then has this opportunity, knowing Jesus' emotional state, and he's completely checked out. James and John too, who are along for the trip, use this opportunity to rest. Now, I'll give them some credit. They just had a rather big meal. It's getting late in the day. It's been an exhausting week. The moment is very obviously heavy. It's pretty clear that they don't know what to do with Jesus' emotional distress, especially since they don't seem to understand it themselves. But their response to Jesus' grief is to take their own nap. And I think this is one of those moments where we're invited to reflect on our own engagement in other suffering. Like, how do we do in moments like this? And kind of easy to understand why they might disengage. It's hard to mourn with those who are mourning, especially when we don't see any reason to mourn, right? Like, if that's not our experience at the time, then it can be a whole lot easier to disengage, which is exactly what these guys do. And they get multiple opportunities to hang in there. Jesus is like, all right, wake up from your nap, still miserable, still need prayer, hang with me, and nothing. And so finally this happens again, and Jesus essentially says, go ahead and sleep. And I think when Jesus says that, he's not talking about physical sleep anymore, because he essentially says, my betrayer's here. Now go rest, go sleep. This is essentially Jesus' invitation to them to abandon him, to do what he knows they are going to do. And this is one of those moments where Matthew does a wonderful job of using words with dual meanings to kind of get his point across. And what they do in this moment is a spiritual nap. They check out, they disengage, they abandon. And in that case, maybe Jesus' follow-up statement, look, my betrayer is here, is about more than just Judas. Of course, Judas walks up at that moment. And this is one of those stories that I think is very compressed, right? Like we're trying to get, okay, Bubba, we're trying to get through. We're trying to get through a lot of information and a lot of story in a very short period of time. And I think what we've always imagined, because of how this compressed version of the story gets told, is that Judas walks up with a bunch of people behind him that are armed with clubs and stuff, and there, is a crowd there to take Jesus. And somehow none of those people know who Jesus is, and there are probably some who don't recognize him, and there are probably some who do, especially since there are in this story some of the temple elders who have had conflict with Jesus in the temple courts who are present in this, kind of crowd that's there. But I think you can expand the potential timeline a little bit and imagine Judas just walking up by himself. That the other people who are with him may not be physically right next to him. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, which, is likely on the Mount of Olives outside of town. They're in kind of an olive press area. This is kind of a place away, a place private. And so, the whole image that we've always had may not be true. Now, it might be, but it doesn't necessarily hold up when we think about it that way. Instead, I think there's still an element of Judas playing both sides of this. His words to Jesus are still very congenial. He still calls him rabbi, calls him his teacher. Of course, Jesus knows what's going on, but Jesus' response to Judas isn't animosity. It is, much like the rest of Jesus' experience here, one of grief. Of course, another disciple responds in rage. I believe it's John that tells us it's Peter who goes ear hunting. And it's not Matthew who even gives us the name of the servant whose ear gets hacked off. And in fact, this is fun. There are some, if you read the Gospels on their own, and remember, the earliest readers did not have access to all four Gospels. They did not have a New Testament. The New Testament, as we understand it, doesn't come into existence even close to what we have for hundreds of years. And then accessible by a literate audience really isn't a thing until the last couple hundred years. So you have this ambiguous statement where one of the disciples strikes at the servant of the high priest, and early readers of Matthew's gospel sometimes understood that to be Judas, who is in this story serving the high priest. He's not his servant directly as far as a role, but he acts in service to the high priest here. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what is happening here, but it's one of those moments where what we now read, 1900 years down the road, is not the same as what some of the earliest readers saw. And I want to highlight some of those differences along the way. Of course, Jesus' response to this action is to put an end to it. And this is maybe that final moment where it becomes clear to Jesus' disciples that what they expect is not what's happening. I think there was always an anticipation of violence. There's a reason that there's a sword present. There's a reason why, one of Jesus' disciples lashes out at this armed mob. And I think what they were anticipating was this sort of conflict that sets the world right. As a sidebar, I think it probably is important to point out that there's still some people who think this is a thing that is going to happen today. You often see, every time there's another conflict in the Middle East, people trying to go dig in prophetic books of the Bible, Revelation being one of them, and come up with how this is like some predicted moment. And if you did our video walkthrough of Revelation, you know why I think that's a poor reading, and why I think biblically it doesn't hold up. But I think it says something about us that we think that that's something that we should be looking for, in spite of the fact that Jesus over and over tells his disciples, like, that's not your lane, that's not your thing to worry about. But Jesus' own disciples thought this was something that was going to happen. How else do you get a king and a kingdom and a throne room and your seats at the left and right hand? And like, that's what has to happen. And when Jesus fails to fulfill their expectations, that's it for them. Jesus' arrest is the end. And it's also the moment when what is it, the last note in verse 56? At that point, all the disciples deserted him and fled. Jesus makes a statement that what's happening is fulfilling prophecy, and essentially their response is, not my Bible. That's not their understanding of those prophetic passages. And so they're done. They flee. They have no desire for what's happening to Jesus to happen to them. They have a lot of desires for the other outcomes, and when those aren't what's happening, then they're out. Not saying that it's an easy choice on their end, and I'm not saying it wouldn't be the choice that many of us made when our expectations of Jesus are not met. Probably similar choices have been made by me, by many of us. And this is the moment where they bail. Peter, of course, we get the note, continues on kind of staying at a distance as a spectator. And he's not interested in being a participant, but he's going to watch from the edges. Of course, we get the final accusation of blasphemy, and the two witnesses that get dug up and are willing to testify against him, and they use his own words. This is something that Jesus said. And I think where we end in verse 67 with the masses is the same place we end with the disciples. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, I think would have been fine if Jesus had done what they all thought he was going to do, what the Messiah was going to do, if they had simply done what they wanted him to do. If he had just kicked out the Romans, if he had just reestablished Israel, if he had just done what they wanted, he would have had the masses with him, without a doubt. And what I hope this causes us to reflect on is our own ways in which we create a Jesus in our own image. I think that's the right way to say that. Because it's a whole lot less challenging to just expect Jesus to be what we think Jesus should be, as opposed to actually digging and having some introspection and wondering and struggling and admitting that we are misguided, fallible, broken people who do not know how the world works, who were not around when the stars were hung, who do not have that understanding. And yet, man, we sure operate like we do. Like we think we've got it all figured out. And so maybe in those moments where our certainty crops up, we should remember the disciples. We should remember the chief priests and leaders and how it was their certainty that ended up being the problem. All right, glad you were with us. I will catch you again next week. See you then.